1 Corinthians chapter 11 tonight. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Certainly a fun chapter, he said facetiously. If you've been reading ahead, you know what I'm talking about already probably. Head coverings. That's what we get to talk about next. Before we get there, let's kind of recap for just a moment. And I don't want to spend a great deal of time doing this, but I think it's important because there is very clearly an attitude that has led to division in the church in Corinth. And that is important to pick up on. I mean, that's how the book opens. That's how the letter opens up. We find conversation about it again here in chapter 10, or in chapter 11 rather. And so there's a great deal that's of this going on. And from chapters, you could connect probably chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14 together as probably dealing with things pertaining to the assembly. And so thinking about some of those things that are going on, and not everything necessarily happening in the assembly, but certainly things that are, when the church is coming together, that seems to indicate the assembly of the church. And so certainly some of those things are happening. But Paul talks about, and kind of ends chapter 10 talking about an example of one who is willing to give up even personal freedoms that they might have in order that they might more effectively serve the cause of Christ. And that seems to be something that's brought out from chapter 8. Again, later in chapter 9, I become all things to all men so that I might, by all means, win more. And so you think about what Paul is saying here, and then you get into chapter 10, and he's trying to get them to flee some of the things that have that appearance out in the area of Corinth, especially some of those things that are connected with Corinth and connected to pagan worship and all of that. And he's like, you need to flee away from those kind of things because ultimately they look like idolatry and you need to stay away from it. And so, and now some of the things that are not far disconnected from that would be how these individuals might look, whether or not they're wearing head coverings or the head covering was just long hair for a woman and so forth, whatever the case may be. And how they might actually look. All that being said, it's thinking about how we also appear to others out in this world. Does it make a difference or not? It does. It absolutely does. We might have the freedoms to go and do certain things, but if it looks like something that's, especially in a particular society, it looks like it could be connected to something that's wrong, and we know that that is wrong, or at least society would say that that's wrong, then we need to flee away from it. We need to stay away from it. And so he's trying to get them to think in that way. And so what you seem to find, at least in Corinth, is a church that's been in existence for a good while, and yet they seem to be almost as babes in Christ because of their attitude and things that they're just some of the things that are going on and the division, the strife that's there, the contentions and so forth, all of this is going on. These are things that they should have been working through already, but they're not doing so. And so Paul's having to kind of walk through these things with them, and obviously answering things particular to letter that they had sent to him, so he's answering some of those specific things. And so, again, I think Paul giving an example of himself being a true servant of Christ. What does that mean? To be a bondservant of Christ. And then Paul makes the statement in verse 1, imitate me or be followers of me as I imitate or follow Christ. And it's very likely the case that probably really goes with the next chapter. But I don't think it's far removed from what he's saying even now to this point. We should be able to say those kind of things. We should be able to tell others, look, I want you to follow me. I'm following Christ. I'm not doing it for my own glory or anything like that. I'm following Christ, and I want you to follow Christ alongside of me. I want you to walk with me in this. And so that's important. We need to be able to say that. But if we look like something else to the rest of the world, we're not going to convert anybody. Nobody wants to be a part of that. So I think that's the indicator here that Paul is saying, we need to think about how the things that we're doing, the things that we say, and how we go about our activities makes a difference when it comes to the possibility of being able to convert the world to Christ. And so again, probably one of the primary objectives of this letter was to condemn some false practices and maybe some false teachings, and I think deal with some specific attitudes, especially kind of like partyism type attitudes, not going out and necessarily partying, but just kind of the sectarian type of idea. I'm of Paul, and I'm of Apollos, and I'm of Cephas, and so forth. This following after different ones. And whatever that worldly wisdom was that caused them to do that, that's what he's trying to shut down, if you will, through this letter. Now, it has become very clear to me that I'm not likely to finish this letter before I leave. And so I'm not sure who will pick it up, or if we'll just have to close the door on it for that time or whatever, but maybe we get Mike over here and let him finish it up for us. Mike will do that. So he's a good guy. I know he'll take care of it. But anyway, no, I know that there's a plan in place already. So, but it does not appear that I'm going to. And so, while at some point I thought, well, maybe you should just start speeding through things. That's just not how I teach, so I can't do it. So, anyway, so here we go. All right, verse 2. He says, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you." Paul spent a great deal of time with these brethren, didn't he? He spent the better part of 2 years, we know, with these brethren. And so he says, keep the things. I want you to remember the things that I taught when I was yet with you. In other words, those things, those ordinances, those are important things. And you have the word ordinances being used in the King James, traditions being used in New King James, American Standard, some others as well. But it's literally the idea of giving over to that which is done by word of mouth or by letter in writing. And so this was, and you remember that we've pointed this out before, but later in chapter 14, in verse 37, Paul says, "If anyone thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things that I write unto you, they are the what? They are the commandments of the Lord," right? And so, just as were the things that he had spoken to them when he was yet with them. And so those were directly from the Lord. And so, again, we see the kind of point being made here. He says, "But I would have you to know," I want you to know, verse 3, "that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man. And the head of Christ is God," a reference to the Father. And so he's trying to set the stage for what I believe to be probably maybe another question that was sent in. And so the instructions here from verses 3 to 16 with regard to head coverings and so forth are difficult, but they're not so far gone that we can't get a handle on this, I believe. So he sets forth a standard of authority in this passage, and that's what we find there in verse 3. I want you to know the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, the head of Christ is the Father, right? So he's kind of set a standard here, and he's talking about authority in all of this. And so he's talking about, in this context, we need to remember that he's talking about authority. That in mind. If you take it out of its context, you can get in some weird things. I guess with any passage you could certainly do that. But this has been used to teach some really strange ideas, certainly through the past, but it's really not all that difficult. Again, think about what they were doing already. Again, with regards to meat that had been offered to idols, and then being involved in some of these feasts afterwards, where that meat had been, whatever was left over at least, was used in those particular feasts, or having a meal with somebody else. And so Paul's, again, trying to get them to think about what you're doing and how that appears to other people. How do you appear to other people, maybe, especially in this particular chapter? So, another thing to keep in mind as we go through this, the text describes things that were certainly customs of that day, and that's important to keep in mind as well. To the way that a woman dressed, showing either her being a prostitute or an unchaste woman, maybe, compared to one who was chaste and faithful to God. And the head covering at the time of this passage also was a sign of submission as well as chastity. And so understanding that, and then the reason that is part of this particular discussion, connected to the idea of authority. That's our context. That's the background. That's the context. That's what's coming here. So Paul begins here with the roles that are, if you will, given to all as it pertains to authority. Something to keep in mind, too, when we look at this is that this is the subject really dealing with authority and not inferiority. And so it doesn't mean that one person is less than another in the eyes of God, but rather God has given certain roles among the church and certain roles even in the home, if you will. And so just the simple fact, we could prove it this way. Christ is not inferior to the Father because He's submitted to the Father in that sense. He is still God, right? John chapter 1 makes that abundantly clear. Neither is the woman inferior to her husband because she is in submission to him. Society would try to teach us something different today. And not really even society as much as a particular agenda of society. So, with that in mind, verse 4. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Every man praying or prophesying. So what does this have to do with? This has to do, the idea of prophesying, to utter forth, to declare a thing that can only be known by divine revelation, by the way. And so to tell forth God's message, prophesying, that's what it is. But to do so uncovered, or rather covered for the man, having his head covered, he dishonors his head. And so he shows disgrace, he puts to shame. Again, when you think about the picture of authority, don't lose that idea of authority in this. And so the man in this passage, in verse 4 here, this is the word for male. And so in contrast to female or even a child. And so this is seen in verse 5 because there's a comparison obviously to the female. And so the veil, if you will, or the head covering of Paul's day was literally an emblem signifying submission, particularly unto another human being. And in the worship service, the man in Paul's day who covered his head with a cloth, or if they wore long hair like a woman, then they were a disgrace to himself and to his head. Who is his head? Christ is his head, right? That's why we point that out earlier. This is all about that line of submission, if you will. And so the customs and the significance of the time cannot be ignored when you're looking, though, at this particular verse, or this section of verses. The male is to be in subjection to those who are leading worship, but to no other human being here. He is in submission to Christ. He would be in also submission then to maybe those who were leading in worship, as in any other man sitting in the audience when someone was leading a prayer. And so those kind of things are logical, make sense. But there's a side note here that I want to give you. This reference should be made in clear distinction that you can clearly see that there's a difference between a man and a woman. Is that correct or not? Okay, I just want to make sure. Just have to ask, right? No, clearly, there's a distinction given. And we can know the difference. So, a male should not dress so as to be confused with a female, nor should a female dress so as to be confused with a male. Now that hasn't really changed by way of society, right? That is a societal norm. We understand that. But particularly to Corinth, it had an extra meaning, if you will, behind it. And so the passage definitely deals with the way that one would appear then in worship, certainly how they would attempt to lead in worship, particularly to the man. And so one can obviously show disrespect by what he or she wears or does not wear in worship. And so think about a couple things. Respect and honor are always to be shown as we worship God. Is that right? Always. There's never a time when we come to worship that we're not to be giving honor and proper respect and paying homage and giving the proper adoration unto God in our worship service. Here's a little side note for you. You think about the Jews have their little skull cap that they wear. That's something that was added much later. That's not something that was even available in Paul's day. They didn't do that. They're not mentioned in Old Testament Jewish covenant. They are of human origin. And so, again, trying to bind something like that, and that's part of the problem as we get into chapter 11, is that you will see that sometimes there's a binding of certain things. And we have to be careful about that. And so we'll have numerous discussions probably about that as we go through this. As pertaining to verse 5, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. And so he's showing, okay, here's a man who's praying or prophesying, a woman who's praying or prophesying. And by the way, he's not getting into when they should be doing this or not. He's just talking about when this is happening. And so there were certain times that this would be appropriate. And he deals much more with that certainly in chapter 14. Okay? But right here he's dealing with it from the standpoint of making the comparison between man and woman and how they would appear in the worship setting. And so being mindful of that. I like what one brother wrote about this. He says, whatever and wherever the praying and prophesying in verse 4 took place, the same view would be held there, the praying and prophesying in verse 5. He says one can go back and observe the definition of prophesying and look at exactly what's being talked about there. When we talk about, it includes teaching, divine teaching that was being done when we're talking about prophesying. And so, whatever this teaching was, this setting was, that's not really what's being discussed here, other than how they look in that particular setting. And especially when they are beginning to lead. And so Paul's later going to talk about that a woman cannot ask questions of the prophets in public assemblies. That's later in chapter 14, verse 34. And so, well, what's Paul's point then if that's not what he's saying here? It's not necessarily the speaking. Clearly, teaching is being done, praying and prophesying, males and females doing the same thing in their proper place in the services. But instead, the difference is revolving around the idea of the way they literally looked, the way they dressed, the way they covered their hair, or covered their head, or didn't cover their head, or maybe the haircut. You say, well, that's getting kind of personal. Well, it was personal, especially in Corinth, because it had a certain meaning behind it. And so, in Corinthian society, it was a mark of immodesty for a woman of proper upbringing to not wear a veil of some type. And whether a piece of cloth being used, it would have probably typically covered her whole head at that point in time. Probably not just a little piece on the back of her head. Okay, this was the idea of showing proper, Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, shamefacedness, humility, in other words. And this also has to do with the idea of respecting her head. Who's the head of woman? Man, particularly her husband, right? So, that being in the background of all of this, it's certain among the Jews that this was the case, but also the Greeks, and so it wasn't lost on the Greeks. So again, one was considered as lacking in decency, if you will, if she went out bareheaded, whether her head was her hair was cut really, really short, or her hair was shaven, or she just didn't have a veil on. And so during that particular time. And most scholars agree that that's what's going on. That's the basic assessment, if you will, of what's happening. The Eastern Society, especially still today, many of them still wear veils. And it has to do with that respect for authority. In its context, again, Paul dealing with the idea of those who were praying and prophesying, but it's not where necessarily this is being done. The woman was told to dress in such a way as to not bring shame upon her or her husband. And again, we find that even later in 1 Timothy chapter 2. She was to dress, she was to act in such a way as befitted her submission to her husband. And so she didn't bring shame upon him in that way. And certainly that's a lesson that we can relate to even today, right? Anytime, I believe, and I think it was Kaufman who made the statement, he says something about any time that men and women, Christian men and women, adopt, he says, the styles of the day, if you will, whether clothing, whether hair, whatever the case may be, but they are accepted as wildly immoral or anti-social or anti-establishment, then that really constitutes a violation even of what we're reading here by way of principle. And so while our society is not bent in this particular way, having to do with especially the priestesses in Corinth who were basically prostitutes and how they wore their hair and what they looked like, how they kept themselves and so forth. And now you see, here's what may very well be the case. What if one of those individuals have obeyed the gospel? They have kept their hair very, very short, maybe even shaved. Well, especially for a time, guess what they probably should do? They probably should wear a veil covering that up, showing that they have, in fact, submitted. And they are now, having left that particular life behind, and now are following Christ, and maybe they don't even have a husband, but they're giving over to the headship of Christ and His church. And so it's very, that would be the reality. When you read 1 Corinthians 6, you read clearly people who have been involved in homosexuality, and very likely prostitution, and all those different types of things out there. Well, these people have lived in this culture and been a part of that, given into those things, not only, but also the men who have participated in those very things. Abusers of themselves with mankind. They have been literally male prostitutes, some of them. But they've come out of that. They've been saved from that, according to 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 11. And so we can imagine then that Paul's having to deal with what this might look like and how they need to look differently than they did when they were out in the world doing those things. And so while society may say it's okay for you to go and to do this and to be a part of this, that was just their pagan culture, that's who they were, that's what they did, no more could they do that in Christ. And so, and the same principle certainly would apply as maybe we go into other cultures at some point in time, and we as we travel about, maybe you go to another country or something like that in a particular mission work, and certain things that are done in that society, if they have an appearance that would look, according to their society, as being immoral, then you would stay far clear from that as a Christian. You wouldn't want to show anything of Christ being connected to those things in that way. And so that's something that certainly, I'm sure, Steve can probably back this up, I'm sure that's part of the conversation when you go into a culture. You have to learn something about the culture so that you know that you don't step across those boundaries. And the principle for all of that is found right here in this particular passage. And so, yes, sir, go ahead. Since I brought your name up. I've been waiting on your comment anyway.
The two I don't know if I call them extremes, but two things I've seen. One of them is when we were in Maui for a couple of months, 2 or 3 years ago, of the probably 30 or 40 people in attendance on a Sunday morning, I would say maybe less than a third of them had pants on. It was shorts. It was flip-flops. It was sandals. And the head guy was typically in shorts. They didn't have elders, but the guy that kind of ran the show. And that was their culture. The island is that way. It's shorts and Hawaiian shirts, whatever. But that is, in that environment, very, very acceptable. You go to South Carolina, a congregation I'm familiar with there, and there are on a Sunday morning of the men that are there, almost everyone will be in a tie. And I have been at services of this particular congregation where I was the only one there not in a tie, and I felt a little bit weird about it. It's like if I offended somebody in my off base here or whatever. But I think we have to show a lot of grace, and we have to understand there are differences of opinion, even within our own congregation. There
Sure.
may be a wide variance of what people consider acceptable or not, and there also may be a wide variance of what people can afford. And there are some among us that can't afford suits, they can't afford ties, they can't afford nice shoes. And so we just need to be careful not to look down on them, but to respect people where they're at. And clearly you can cross over into a disrespectful demeanor and whatever, but I just think it's an area that does require a lot of grace and not too much judgment.
Yeah, and I think so. And I think that's why, for us especially, because this was a thing particular to the culture at Corinth, what was happening there that they were dealing with, this is certainly one of those times that you see, okay, this is a cultural passage, but the principle is still there. And the principle has already been set forth in this letter to think about your brother and sister in Christ, right? And so whatever you do, don't cause them to stumble. whatever you do, be thoughtful of them to help them in their walk. Whatever you do, be thoughtful of them that you might edify them and build them up. And so the principle certainly has kind of already been set forth in this. And then you find the principle here thinking about, okay, in certain cultural situations, we need to think about this. In our society, even a couple of decades ago, the church dressed quite differently than it does now. And so, at least in the continental U.S., some of the Western congregations, Western United States congregations, not as much, not as formal. And so you come back to the East, and then I'm sure Mike can attest to that too, probably even in seeing congregations out West. But you have to, you start looking at this passage and how Paul's dealing with this. He's trying to get them to think about, okay, your life and the way that you're living your life, even down to, yes, even the way that you cut your hair might have an effect on somebody. And so we certainly need to be mindful of that. And on the other side of things, as Steve has pointed out, we have to give a great deal of grace because somebody used to say, what about your boy's hair is, kind of growing out a little bit long. Shouldn't he get it cut? Or one time he had gotten it cut and it was cut too short and they didn't like that. So you know what? It's hair. So that's kind of the approach that we kind of took with that. It was hair. It wasn't going to make that big of a deal to us personally. But certainly in certain places, it was shocking. Say again?
It's your heart.
Certainly.
Your heart.
Yeah.
If you're being rebellious,
Yeah.
if they had a rebellious attitude,
Yeah.
then we're not happy.
And yes, absolutely. And I think what he's trying to make sure here is that people don't think that these individuals are being rebellious. He doesn't want them to come off as being rebellious. This is something for any individual to be prophesying or praying. These were divine messages given from heaven. So this was God, ordaining them, using them to bring about this particular message. And so, but he certainly wanted them to not take away from the message. Hopefully that makes sense here. If I put it that way, that's the simplest way that I could put it. So, verse 6, let's put a couple of these verses together. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. So again, this comes into that cultural picture here. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but the woman is from man. So this kind of goes to the order of creation, obviously, thinking about that. And Genesis 1, 2, and so forth gives us certainly the picture of that. Nor was man created for the woman, but the woman was created for the man. And so for this reason, he says, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. We'll deal with the angels here, that part of that, and it may just simply be messengers, or it could be literally the messengers from God. Nonetheless, the word simply means messenger. But in this section from verse 5 through what we've just read down to verse 10, you have this idea of this back and forth. But again, he connects it directly to Christ being the authority over man, and therefore man needs to glorify God in what he does, to glorify Christ in what he does. And the woman, the very same thing. She is the glory of man. She was made for man, therefore she is to glorify him and show him honor and submit to that authority. That's how that honor and glory is given to one who is higher than us, is by our submission, our humility, our submission. And so for her, in that particular society especially, that certainly meant some type of covering. But for the man, it did not. And so Paul connects those things and says, look, in this particular situation, here's how this needs to be handled. Whatever we're doing, we ultimately want to bring glory unto God. And so whatever would be in the way or standing in the way of that needs to be gotten rid of, right? And so that's ultimately where he's at and trying to teach them. And I know I'm kind putting a couple of these verses together, I want to get down to and deal with this. He says, for this cause, for this reason, the woman ought to have the symbol of authority on her head. And again, a sign of a husband's authority over his wife. Literally was all this meant. And so while the angels part of this is difficult, it doesn't change the meaning of it regardless of who this particularly is. Is it heavenly angels or messengers of which Paul is speaking? Whoever it is, they report to God. And thus the woman must recognize her actions are not going unnoticed in what she's doing, because those things are going to ultimately be reported to God, right? Because they are reporting to God. The woman, third thing to pick up in this passage, probably has to do with, and it's not just the women in this passage, but it would also be the men. Don't step out of the role that's been given to you. Men who will not step up into that role that has been given to them, roles of authority in leading in worship, there's a shame in that, because that submission brings glory unto the Father. And so we all should be serving in whatever talent, capability, or ability that we have. We need to be thinking about that. The woman as well, in her particular role. That's how, by her humility, her submission unto her husband as unto Christ. You think about Ephesians 5, verse 21, submitting one to another as unto the Lord. This is kind of that same type of mentality here. They're submitting to one another as unto the Lord. And so this is what's going on. And if we could say anything here, angels are watching, right? Let's just put it that way in this passage. You go ahead.
It's always helpful for me, especially in this passage, to try to put myself in the context of like modern women reading this. It's very confusing, if you're coming from a modern woman's perspective to a certain extent,
Or even from Western civilization.
Yeah, even from Western
Right.
society in general. And
Yeah.
I think it's important for us to realize that for the woman that was coming out of the typical Corinth into the church, you were coming from a society that women were marginalized completely and
Sure.
exploited.
Yeah.
And so imagine that you come into the church and now you're a Christian. Now all of a sudden you have a different level of value. You're learning that as you were created, not that you're equal to man, but you have a higher value than society is placing on you.
Absolutely.
And so what's happening here in Corinth, really is they're taking advantage of this freedom, to a certain extent. And the world is watching.
Right.
And even the angels are watching.
Yeah.
This. And Paul's just simply reminding them, there still is male spiritual leadership. That was God ordained from the very beginning,
Right.
back in Genesis. And I think, the struggle for us is you have women coming into the church, and now they're looking at it as this principle of male spiritual leadership. Siri doesn't understand, apparently.
Been there.
They're coming in from modern society, and they're looking at it as being too restrictive, right? So you got women that are coming from a culture in which women were not valued enough, and then you've got modern women coming into the church, and they're saying this is too restrictive. And in either case, what Paul is doing and what we've got to do is align ourselves with God's principles from the beginning, and that's this whole principle of male spiritual leadership which permeates this section. And so, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
It is.
It's helpful to look at it from those two different angles.
I think so, and I think also when you think about in every generation, it's unfortunate that people have taken the extreme views of that, and especially to try to twist this passage into something that's not teaching. But certainly, I think Paul ultimately teaches, especially in the next couple of verses, to kind of illustrate that. He shows the dependence that each have on one another as they depend upon Christ. And so let's just catch those before we run out of time. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. Again, think of it in as within their roles, their God-given roles. And so as the woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. And so this goes back to, okay, who sets the standard? Is it man, or is it woman, or is it God? All things are God, right? And so all things come from God. And so he says, verse 13, judge among yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. And if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. And so he says, okay, look out among you. You should be able to judge this just looking at the natural things around you. Look at society, be able to tell what's going on. Numerous times in the Corinthian letters, Paul says, judge you yourselves, right? You need to be, is there not anyone wise who can judge this thing? I mean, Paul keeps asking them, right? You're going to have to make some judgments. But you're going to have to look around also in this particular situation, and you can see the natural thing, and it's not, the natural thing is, guess what? Hair grows. I need a haircut right now. I feel like it. But the point is that's a natural thing for all of our hair to grow, man or woman. So that's not the natural thing that he's talking about. But the natural thing, when you look into society, what is it that society is saying is the normal thing for people to be doing? And so he's saying you can make that judgment and determine then what you need to do as such. And if anyone's coming along and just wants to fight about it, guess what? The Greeks loved a good debate. They did. That's what they wanted to do. I remember Paul and Mars Hill and Athens. Man, they're just waiting for another debate to come along, right? We just want to hear some new thing. We just want to hear someone, and so we wait around. Oh, here's the new guy. Let's bring him up here. Let's put him up here. Let's hear what he has to say. And then the debate goes on, right? That's what they love. And if anybody wants to be contentious, he says, look, we have no such custom, nor does the church. So what does Paul say? What is Paul saying at the end of all of this? Say again?
That it's not mandated?
It's not mandated. But unfortunately, some have tried to mandate and bind. We'd use that word. Say again?
Actually, it was not commanded himself with the fact that the woman was inferior to the man.
Yeah. Right. And that's how she showed that subjection too, was by doing so. And so to undo that, to take that away from her, showed rebellion and a rejection of authority. And so certainly nobody wants to be accused of that.
Hey, Wayne, I think that a challenge for us, if we can kind of look at this more broadly, is when we're studying the Bible with people, we talk about, the Bible is inspired by God, it's His Word, and we're pretty particular about things in Scripture, commandments, and the organization of the church, the function of the church, and on and on and on. We take things literally, and we even speak about patterns. We're supposed to follow the pattern.
Yeah.
And yet occasionally we have a passage like this where we say, well, except when it's cultural, except when it's something that was the culture, and we don't have to do it. And the question will come up when you're studying with people, and this may be something we can talk about next week, but the question will come up, well, how do I know what is cultural, and how do I know what is a pattern, and I'm supposed to follow it? And there are even women today in the church, even in churches of Christ, who we have sojourner friends, to this day, they will cover their heads, and they believe they need to do that. That's their conscience.
Right.
And I think we may want to spend a little bit of time on looking at how do we know what is culture. You have to have an advanced degree in the culture of the time or understand that environment. But how do we know what's a pattern, and how do we know what's culture, and how do we teach that to people and differentiate? Because that is going to come up over and over again.
Yeah, I think so. And I think verse 16 sets the stage, saying, in the church we don't have that. We're not binding that. for sure. And so you should be able to look out in society, he says nature, and see the natural thing going on around you and be able to tell some of that. And so that's how he deals with it here, but we'll get into more of that, and I appreciate that, because this probably also comes into the next conversation that we deal with in speaking about even the Lord's Supper. All right. Thank you for your comments and your attention tonight.